Hello everyone, Mr. Love here, coming to you from the diesel shop. Today we're going to be talking about something very important. We're going to be talking about the hub assembly here on an axle. So we're going to be removing the hub. We're going to do the inspection on it. We're going to reinstall the hub. We're going to show you a couple different types of the nuts that hold the hub on there. And we're going to talk about why it's so important that we put everything to the proper torque when we put it together here. So let's get started. Okay, so when we get started here, you're going to want to make sure you have some sort of tray underneath here. Make sure you have a rag handy. Sometimes you do get a little bit of oil out. So after you take off all the axle bolts here that hold the axle in place, you can just pry the axle out of there. It should slide right out. This one's been cut off, but usually it'd be longer where it goes into the differential. Lock it into the differential so it engages this with the differential. So we'll just pull this axle out. We'll set that off to the side. We don't need that anymore. Now you can see in there we got a nut inside there. So I'm going to take this out, this nut out of there. I'm going to pull the whole assembly off. Then I'm going to assemble a couple different style nuts without the hub in our way so we can see it a little bit better here. So make sure you have your proper socket on there. This style here has little locks that have to be depressed. You can only take it off with the socket. Right now if I tried unscrewing it by hand, it would be stuck in place. It needs to head the socket over to be able to spin. So even if it's loose in there, which these usually are, you'll see why when we get to torque it and everything. But usually they're only hand tight for this style anyways, but you just have to have a socket on there to spin it out. So got to keep the socket on there the whole time, even though it spins pretty easy. Okay, so we got it out. We'll talk more about it here in a minute. We'll set that off to the side. We're done with our socket for now. Now we should be able to slide the hub off. The bearing inside there will pop out. So what I like to do is I like to kind of position my thumb kind of in there just to catch the bearing on my thumb. So as I pull it out, that bearing's going to slide onto my thumb. Like so. You never want to drop the bearing. Now would be a good time to inspect it too. Just check it all out, make sure there's no scores in there. Make sure it's not blued from overheating or anything. I like to take a nice clean rag, lay it down someplace. We'll put our bearing right on there. Okay, now we can pull our hub the rest of the way off. So we'll set that on our tray here. So this hub style here has a spacer for the bearings. Most hubs aren't going to have this, but this style does. The spacer just kind of goes on there. You'll see why when we put our bearings on there. Kind of spaces them out where you want them. Sometimes there's just little spacers that go back here. Sometimes there's no spacers at all, so just use whatever spacers come out of there. So we'll take that out for now, just set off to the side. We'll inspect our hub here. So inside our hub here, we have our inner bearing that's down in there behind the wheel seal. So anytime you pull one of these apart, since there's oil that's got inside this hub here, you want to replace this wheel seal. Usually with ones that have grease and stuff, they're a little more forgiving. You'd usually reuse the seals, a couple times, like on your little at-home trailers you tow behind your pickups and stuff. You could reuse those seals a couple times. These ones here, they're only one-time use, so whenever you pull the bearing out, replace the seal, put a new seal in there, we put it all back together. For this video purpose here though, we're not going to do that. We're just going to set it off to the side for now. Okay, we got our hub out of the way. We're just going to now install 3 different nut types that we have here, just to show you 3 different kinds of nuts that would go on here to keep the axle on. It's very important to put these on the proper torque. Make sure you have all the hardware that comes with it in there. Make sure you have on the locking devices if it has it. If for some reason these nuts come off of here, the whole tire's bolted together, bolted to the hub assembly here with the 2 tires bolted onto it and the brake drum onto it would all come off as one unit. So going down the road, if something happened to these nuts out here where they failed, this whole assembly with the axle and everything would come right off of here, and you'd have about 800 to 1,000 pounds of, just pure rolling force, going down the highway. There's videos and stuff of duels come off together. They actually go through houses, come out the other side of them. You know, it's very easy to kill someone. So always make sure you follow the proper instructions. Always make sure that the nuts and stuff that you're putting on there are in good shape. Make sure all the locking tabs and everything are, you know, functioning and stuff on them. Check everything out on them. Okay, so we're also going to use our Stemco guide here. This works on a lot of different heavy duty axle types here. So basically it's just 7 easy steps. I know it seems like a lot here, but when you're doing this every day, you do it quite a bit. It only takes probably about 5 minutes to set everything where it should be, using a torque wrench, using a dial indicator to check the backlash and everything. So it's really easy to do. There's no reason why you shouldn't be doing this. It'll prolong the bearing life. It'll help our wheel seal. It'll also, you know, make sure that everything's torqued on here properly so the wheels don't come off going down the road and kill somebody. So we're going to set this off to the side for now. I'm just going to show you the 3 different types of wheel nuts here. So our first one we're going to be doing, so we'll put our sleeve back on there for now, just so we have something for the bearing to go against, so we can torque this down, torque our nuts down. We're just going to install our outer bearing back on there. Normally you would put this in the hub and everything. We'll go over that later in the video. This is just on here so I can show you the different types of nuts here. So we have our bearing on there. The first type we're going to cover is just a single nut, but you'll see it has little locking tabs on the side of it. So this is the one I just took off of there. So the only way to get this style off is to have the socket on there to push those tabs in. You can see those tabs go into this outer ring here. This outer ring has a little tang on there. That little tang goes right into a groove on the axle housing here. So this locks the nut right onto the axle housing so it can't spin when these tangs are engaged. So this one here, you can see the tangs are keeping that from spinning. If for some reason you tried turning this really hard without a socket over there, you can break the little tangs off of there, like this one here. This one here, if I hold it, I could actually spin it because it's broken. So that's something you want to inspect. Make sure that both little tangs are on both sides here. You can see it's locked in right there. That way I won't be able to spin it at all. Okay, so we'll put this style on first just so you can see. Very simple. Remember, it has to be inside a socket. So we push it in the socket. You can see now the outside locking ring spins freely. So the biggest thing when you put these on, you just got to take this little tang here, line it up with that groove. Otherwise, you'll be fighting it the whole time. You just kind of slide it in there. Then you got to keep the socket on the whole time. And just run it all the way on. Usually it'd be down inside the hub there. We'd have the hub on there at this point, but this is just for video purposes so you can see it better. So there's quite a few threads here, so it takes a minute to screw it all the way on there. Okay, so now we're bottomed out there, down at the end where it needs to be here. So now for this style here, we'll just go through the torque and sequence real quick on it. We won't use the torque wrench for this one. We'll just talk about it. Then when we go to put the hub on, we'll actually use the torque wrench. So we just have our ratchet here. So what our instructions tell us to do here. So it's a drive axle. The threads per square inch, it could either be 12 threads per square inch or 16, but both of them are going to be the same for the drive axle. So it doesn't matter what style we have here, it's going to be the same for a drive axle nut. We just have to go off the sheet here. So what it's telling us to do is do our initial torque to 200 foot-pounds. So I know this isn't a torque wrench, but I'll be using the torque wrench later on. So I'm going to torque this down to pretend 200 foot-pounds right now. So I torque it down, get down to my 200, I get my little click, 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 click. Okay, now for step number 3 here, tells me to back it off 1 full turn. So now I would back it off 1 full turn here. Okay, now we go to the next step. It tells me to now torque it to 50 foot-pounds. So I'll adjust my torque wrench, torque it back down here to 50 foot-pounds. Click, click. And now for my final back off here, for step number 5, it tells me to back it off 1/4 turn. So I'll flip this in reverse again. Back it off 1/4 turn there. And for this style here, now I'm done right now. This should give me the proper end play. I'll show you how to check end play here in a little bit. So that's a single nut style here. So it should be all locked in there right now with these little tabs locking it into the spindle so it can't back itself off. You can see it's free to roll around there, but it won't unscrew out of there without depressing the little tabs here. Okay, so let's get this one off. We'll do a next style here. Okay, so the first one we're going to do here is a Tang-style. So on this one here, we're going to have 2 nuts. And we're going to have this little lock and tank thing that goes in between the 2 nuts. So the first thing we're going to do is put our inner nut on. Make sure it's lined up on there good before you screw it on there. It should go on nice and smooth. If it doesn't go on nice and smooth, take it back off and see why. Make sure it has good threads in the nut. In the nut part, make sure it has good threads on the spindle part. So we'll screw this all the way down in. Okay. Now it tells us to, so we go to our next step here. It tells us to torque it at 200 foot-pounds, just like the other one. So we'll use our make-believe torque wrench here. When we do this for real, we're going to be using a torque wrench, but just for this purpose, we're just pretending. So I'm going to torque it down to 200, have my click there. Okay, so same step as the other one. I'm going to back it off a full turn. So what happens every time we torque to 200 to begin with, it's going to make sure our bearing's seated all the way, make sure our wheel seal's seated all the way up to where it needs to be up there. So now we're going to back it off of there. So the reason we're torquing it to 200 to begin with, before we back it off, is so we get everything seated. So if we have a wheel speed sensor, it'll set the gap properly on that. It'll make sure our tone ring's seated all the way, make sure our wheel seal's seated all the way in there, make sure our bearing's seated all the way. So we do that initial 200 foot-pound torque just to make sure everything's seated, and we're going to back it off a full turn. So we're backed off a full turn now. Now we're going to torque it again to 50. So we got it torqued down to 50 now, click, click. Now, according to our sheet, we're going to back it off a 1/4 turn. Okay, so we're backed off a 1/4 turn now, so we should be done with that inner nut. Okay, so now we take our little tang flange here. You can see that has a little tang sticking off of this side of it here, and it has a bunch of them on the outside here. So the one that's on the inside here, we line up with our groove here again, kind of like our other nut was. Make sure it slides on there all the way. Get it all the way back there. Then we're going to take our outer nut here. We're going to screw that down there all the way. So our outer nut here, this is where it's going to get the big torquing done to it. So our outer nut here, for the Tang type washer, gets torqued to 275 foot-pounds. So we're going to take our torque wrench here, torque it at 275. So we're going to torque it right down. Click, click, 275. Okay, so now you can see where the little locking tabs are going to come into play here. You can see that they're sticking up all around the nut. So now what we're going to do, we'll take a hammer or a pry bar, stick in there, and actually bend those tabs over the nut so the nut can't back off. So normally you couldn't be able to get a hammer in there because the hub would be on there. Normally you could just take a lady slipper or something, slip in the hub there, pry off of the hub itself if the hub was on there, and bend these tabs over. So tabs bend over pretty easy. So you just bend a couple of those tabs over so it goes over the outside nut so the outside nut can't back off at all. Just you have to remember they're on there for when you go to take it off. You just take a punch or a chisel and straighten them back out. So that's our first 2-nut style we're going to talk about. Now we'll talk about our next one here. One here's another 2-nut type setup. So this one's actually called a dowel type. So the one nut on this is going to have a little dowel sticking out of it. You can see there's a little nub on there. It's going to have a little ring with holes on it like that, where you'll see when we go to torque this down, that little nub is going to lock in there. So we'll pull our one nut off of this one here. Okay, so the nut that has the little dowel sticking out on it, that's going to go on first. Like I said, you got to make sure it's lined up perfectly. Should screw on pretty easy once you get it lined up right. Okay, so just like our instructions before, it tells us to torque this one down to 200 foot-pounds to seat everything. So we take our torque wrench, torque it down, 200, click, click. Same as the other one, we're going to back it off 1 full turn. Okay, it's all the way backed off now. It also tells us to spin the hub and stuff while we do this, but you'll see that when we go assemble the hub on there. Okay, so we're backed off the full turn now. Now it tells us to torque it down to 50 foot-pounds. Have our torque wrench set to 50. Take it to 50, click, click. Now, according to our sheet there, it tells us to back it off a 1/4 turn. Back it off 1/4 turn. Okay, now we get our little locking ring on there. So our locking ring, see, has that same little tang on the inside as our other ones do. So what we want to do, we want to slide this locking ring on there, and we want to line up the dowel with one of the holes. So if it doesn't line up the first way, these little holes here aren't really symmetrical. They're offset, so if you turn it over the other way, now they're offset the other way. So you got to flip it back and forth to see which way is the closest here. So that one there gets us lined right up on there. Sometimes you might have to adjust the inner nut just a smidge back and forth. You could usually do it by your hand at that point because remember it's backed off. There shouldn't be any tension on it. Okay, so we got that locked in there. You shouldn't be able to move the inner nut or the ring. It should be locked into place there. So now we're going to take our outer nut and put on there. The outer nut's going to be one without the tang on it, or the dowel. So make sure it's still on the dowel when you tighten that nut down. So tighten it down hand tight, make sure everything's good on there. Now we're going to torque it down to what it says. So this one here, with the dowel type for a drive axle, tells us to torque the outer nut, the jam nut, 300 to 400 foot-pounds. So usually if I was out in the field, I would torque it to 400 just because I don't want that coming off. But for our purposes here, I'm just going to torque it to 300. So I got my imaginary torque wrench here. I'm going to torque it down to 300 foot-pounds. Click, click, 300. Okay, now I'm all done on there. You'll see when we put the hub on there, the last step we'd have to do is check the backlash of the hub to make sure that we're within spec of it, going in and out, the free play inside there. So I'm going to pull these nuts off real quick, then we'll install a real hub on there. Now we're going to install the hub on here. There's a few things you should do first before you install the hub. Wipe everything down, make sure everything's nice and clean. Inspect the seal area here, make sure there's no gouges or rust or anything built up on there. If there's any rust or anything built up, make sure you clean it off with like a whiz wheel or some very fine sandpaper. Make sure everything's really clean here, otherwise it's going to fight you going on there, and it can cause bearing damage if the bearings are seized up on here. You can also see we have our speed sensor over here right now. So what we want to do at this point, we want to take a pry bar and pry out on our speed sensor a little bit. So we'll slide our speed sensor out here. So now when we do our initial torque of torquing it down to 200, it's going to set the air gap and everything where it needs to be on our speed sensor here. Okay, so just inspect our bearing and our seal. We should have a new seal and everything in here. We should have had our bearing out, checking that out. We should have cleaned the inside of the hub out. in the parts washer and everything, make sure there's no metal filings or anything like that. Okay, so now we're all ready to install. So take some gear oil now, or whatever oil goes inside the hub, and just put a little bit on where the seal rides on here. Put a little bit on top, and we'll let it run both ways here. Then kind of just put a line down through here where the bearings are going to ride. Okay, now we're going to just take our hand, and we're just going to rub it all around here. Get that oil spread out everywhere on here. Make it nice and slippery for our bearings to go on, and for our seal to slide up over here. If we don't have any oil on when we slide this seal on right here, chances are it's going to damage your seal on you. So make sure you wipe your hands off good, because that gear oil can be very sticky. Okay, we'll put our cap on that, put it off to the side so we don't knock it over. We're done with that for a few minutes. Okay, so now we're going to take our hub assembly here. This one's an aluminum one, so it's pretty light, but we want to make sure everything's lined up as best we can. We want to just slide it on there, straight on there. Let it go all the way to the back, then you can kind of let it rest there a little bit. Don't be forcing it on there or anything, because you could damage the seal. So you want it to slide on nice and easy. So on this style here, we have that bearing spacer in there. Just make sure that goes on the right way. The tapered usually comes out if it has this type on there. If it's just a ring, make sure it's sitting where it's supposed to be. So we'll just slide that up in there. Okay, now our outer bearing here. Put a little bit of oil on our bearing here. We want to, remember, use the same oil you're putting in there. So just lubricate this bearing here. It'll help it when it first starts out before it gets oil flung around in there. Also, there's a couple other ways you can do this right now. Sometimes it's a good idea to take some gear oil, squirt it in the hub assembly right now. Get a little bit in the hub, that way when you first start out, it gets oil to the bearings. What I usually like to do is usually after I do a wheel bearing and wheel seal and stuff, I top off the differential, overfill it just a little bit to let it come out to where it's supposed to be out here. So you can do it either way, just make sure you got oil in there before you start driving down the road. Okay, so our wheel bearing now, the tapered way goes in. Just lift up on the hub a little bit. Make sure this is nice and straight on there, otherwise it's going to jam on you. Just slide it in as far as you can by hand there. Sometimes it might want to pop out on you. If it does that, just keep a little tension on it until we get our nut on there. It's fine if it moves back and forth a little bit. So for this one here, we're going to put on all the way here. We're going to use the one with the little dowel pin sticking on it there. So remember, the dowel pin goes out. Okay, so now I'm just going to use my ratchet here to run it on all the way. I'm not going to go tight with it here. I'm going to torque it once I get all the way to where I need to be. So as you're putting this on, make sure you give it a little spin every now and then. Make sure everything's still, wheeling around there pretty nicely. Feels like a long ways once you're going. Sometimes you can do it by hand if you get your hand in there okay. I'll try a little bit by hand here. Push our hub back, spin it a little bit by hand. Okay, so we got it a little bit tight there. We'll just go a little bit, make sure we're seated on there. Okay, now we'll get out our torque wrench and we're going to torque it down to 200. So before we torque it, we'll give it a little spin there. Make sure it's not binding on anything. We have our torque wrench here. I just set it a second ago. We're set at 200. Okay. Now this is where you're going to have to flop the socket back and forth a few times here. Okay, so make sure we're going the right direction. Put it on there. We're going to torque it down to 200. 200 is quite a bit, it feels like. Okay, we've got a nice strong click there. We're at 200. So now it tells us to back it off a full turn. We don't back stuff off with the torque wrench. Now we're going to switch back to our ratchet. Switch back to our ratchet. We'll back it off a full turn there. It's okay if you go a little bit beyond the full turn. It doesn't have to be exact. You just want at least a full turn out of it. Okay, now we're going to switch ratchets back to our torque wrench. This time we're going to torque it to 50 foot-pounds, so we'll back this off now. Okay, so now we're at 50 here. We're going to torque it down. Click, click. Hear that little click there? It's not going to be as strong as click now just because it's only going to 50 instead of 200. So we're torqued at 50 now. Now it tells us to back it off again. So we're going to switch ratchets again. We're going to back it off according to our sheet, 1/4 turn. So there's 1/4 turn. Okay, so we're done with that part there. We'll set that off to the side for a minute. Now we've got to put our little dowel locking tab in there. Remember, line the tang up with the cut groove there. Didn't fit that way, we'll flip it over. I have to wiggle a little bit to get it on there. Okay, we got that on there now. Now we're going to put our outside nut on there. The outside nut shouldn't have the dowel on there. So if you see a dowel at this point, you did it backwards. Okay, so now we got our outside jam nut on there. We check our specs here. Tells us for the dowel type to torque it to 300 to 400 foot-pounds. So we'll get out our big torque wrench here. So this one here we're going to torque to 300. Okay, so this one here is a little gauge on there, so we're going to watch the gauge as we go around. Okay, right there's about a little over 300 there, so as long as we're between 300 and 400. Like I said, out on the road, I usually like to get it to about 400, just to, better safe than sorry, but since we're going to be taking this one apart again here, I just torqued it to the 300. Okay, so now we're all set with the torquing part of it. Now we got to check it to make sure we have proper end play here. So we're going to use a magnetic base dial indicator. Our dial indicator here measures in thousandths. You can see when it pushes on this, it moves it around. Each little line's a thousandths of an inch. The base on here is magnetic, has an on-off button. You push to turn the magnet off. You push it that way to turn the magnet on. We're going to put the magnet right on the metal part of the hub here, on the spindle itself. Our hub on this one's aluminum, so we can't hook to that. If it was a steel or cast hub, you could put the magnet onto there. So we're going to get everything set here to, if you loosen up this other rod, we can move our arm around a little bit here. We want to get it to a certain location on here. If we have to, we can, our aluminum hub here. They do make clamp-on ones too. We normally use on the aluminum ones. Okay, so I got it set here again now, so now we'll try it one more time. Okay, you guys probably can't see that on the camera there, but we got about 2 thousandths end play right there. So that means there's 2 thousandths, back and forth movement in there. Our spec calls between 1 and 5, so we're perfect right there. So we're all done with this. We can take this off. Set this off to the side. Be very careful with it. It's a precision measuring device. Always make sure you give this a spin. As you're doing your torquing and stuff too, you should spin it a couple times. Make sure everything's seated well inside there. Make sure it's not binding up as you're going. But that's all there is to that part. So now we would just install our axle. We'd put a new gasket on there. We'd use RTV on there. Slide our axle in there. And then just tighten our outer nuts on. We're all set there. You can see this one here's a steer axle. This setup here is kind of the same that we were going two before here. So this one here has two different nuts, and it has a little lock tab spacer, kind of like the other one there. So we would just use our little sheet here. We would look here for all the different steps. So step number one, be the same, just lubricate the bearing, slide it together. Step number two, the initial adjusting torque is going to be the same. We're going to tighten it to 200 foot-pounds. That way it'll seat everything. Step three is the same, the initial back off, where we back it off a full turn. Step four is the final adjusting. We're going to torque it to 50 foot-pounds. Step five is where it's going to be different since it's a steer axle. So we go to steer axle double nut because there's two nuts. And we're going to back it off a half turn instead of the quarter that we were doing before. So we're going to back the inner nut off a half a turn. Then we can put our little locking tab in there. We can put our outside nut on there. Then we tighten our jam nut down. So our steer axle double nut. So you measure the shaft size. So if it's under 2 5/8, it's 200 to 300 foot-pounds. If it's over 2 5/8, it's 300 to 400 foot-pounds. So this one here is under 2 5/8, so this would be 200 to 300 foot-pounds that we would torque our outside one to. So our steer axle on our heavy-duty equipment is going to have the oil cap and stuff on there. So this one here, instead of putting hub oil and stuff in there, as you fill it up, and there's no differential, so you can't fill it up with the differential, you put our cap on there with a new seal on there, or RTV, put it on there, then you'll see there's a little fill plug right here where you could fill it up at. Just fill it up to this level right here. There's a full and add. It's pretty simple. You put some in there, you go do something else, come back, a half hour later, it'll go down a little bit, you fill it up again, go do something else, come back a half hour later, fill it up again. Usually takes, between a half hour and an hour for that thick gear oil to get all through all the bearings and everything to where it needs to be. So there's usually a few reasons why you got to pull the hub off. Usually on this style here, you're just pulling the hub off because of the leaking wheel seal. So the biggest cause of leaking wheel seals is usually this little breather right here, this differential breather. If this is plugged up and can't spin like that, it builds up pressure inside here as the oil expands, and it'll blow our wheel seal right out. So that's the leading cause. Second leading cause is probably inaccurate backlash. You got too much backlash, so the seal's not sealing properly. And third would probably be just putting it in wrong to begin with. So this is the leading cause. I've seen this countless times where dirt and stuff gets up on here. Doesn't matter if it's a small car, or big truck, or tractor, they all have differential breathers of some sort. Just make sure they're cleaned out and you can blow through them easily. You can unscrew it out of there if you need to question it for any reason. This one here is a simple design. It's just hollow in there. Some of them have a filter and stuff in there, but you should be able to blow through any of them pretty easily. So as we talked about, always go by the manufacturer's instructions. This one here, we just use the Stemco Seals nut torque specs here. So it's pretty good. It gives you a different breakdown of different size axles, like steer axles. If it has a single nut or double nut. If it's a trailer axle. On the back side here, it has Pro Torque, which is another type of nut that we'll talk about a different time. So all these nuts, they all work pretty good. If you're going to go out and buy a new set of nuts for it, I'd get the Pro Torque one. We'll talk about that in class a little bit, but the Pro Torque's definitely the way to go. Other than that, these other ones work pretty good. I've seen a lot of flange type ones fail, so I'm not a huge fan of these. These are the fastest ones to put on. As you saw, we only have one nut to deal with. We don't have a jam nut. We don't have little locking tabs or anything. So this is the fastest one to take on and off. But these little tabs fail, then it just backs off on its own. And we definitely don't want that to happen while going down the road. So I'm a pretty good fan of the nuts with the locking tabs. The dowel ones are good as long as you really tighten that outside jam nut. So that's all there is today, guys. So be safe out there.